Firebase Delta, 14 kilometers west of Nui Dat, South Vietnam. March 23, 1968, 3:47 hours. Staff Sergeant Chen, United States 173rd Airborne Brigade, jolted awake to a sound that made his blood run cold. Not incoming mortars, not rifle fire, something worse: silence. Absolute, unnatural silence where there should have been noise. His fire support base housed 147 American soldiers. Guard towers manned every 50 meters. Listening posts positioned 200 meters out in every direction. Claymore mines, trip flares, and early warning systems covering every approach. Yet somehow, in the last 3 minutes, every single perimeter alarm had been systematically neutralized without triggering a single alert. Chen grabbed his M16 and keyed his radio. Tower 3 reports status, static. LP North come in, more static. His heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't equipment failure. This was something professional, something terrifying. Then he saw it. Movement in the darkness, 30 meters from his bunker. Not the clumsy stumbling of VC sappers, not the rushed advance of an assault wave. Smooth, controlled, almost liquid movement through terrain his men had considered impenetrable. Shapes materialized from shadows that shouldn't have contained shapes. Chen raised his rifle, finger on trigger, and that's when the voice came from directly behind him. Australian accent, calm as Sunday morning. "Morning, Sergeant. Your firebase is dead. You died 14 minutes ago, you just don't know it yet." Chen spun around. 5 men stood there, faces painted, weapons pointed at nothing and everything, having penetrated his command bunker without making a sound. The lead figure, an Australian SAS warrant officer, held up a small device. "We've tagged 37 of your key positions with these simulators. Crew-served weapons, command posts, ammo dumps, communications. In a real attack, they'd all be gone. Your perimeter is Swiss cheese, your listening posts are blind, and your defensive plan has more holes than a screen door." Chen's mind reeled. "How did you?" "We have interlocking fields of fire, early warning." "You have exactly what we expected you to have," the Australian interrupted. "Predictable, textbook, and utterly useless against anyone who knows what they're doing. We've been inside your wire for 93 minutes. We could have killed your commander, destroyed your artillery, and been gone before your first guard rotation noticed. Your base isn't secure, mate. It's a shooting gallery and you're the targets. This wasn't an enemy attack, this was worse. This was a training exercise conducted by Australian advisors to prove a point that shattered Chen's entire understanding of battlefield control. The Americans didn't own this war. They never had. They were moving through a battle space they didn't understand, fighting an enemy they couldn't see, while the Australians operated on a completely different level of warfare. What happened at Firebase Delta that night was just the beginning. Over the next 6 months, American units across Vietnam would experience a devastating revelation. Every time they partnered with Australian forces, every time they watched Australian tactics, every time they compared results, the same horrifying truth emerged. The Australians weren't just better at jungle warfare. They controlled the battlefield so completely that American forces looked like amateurs stumbling through someone else's game. Today you're going to hear the classified truth about how US troops discovered they were the targets in a war they thought they were winning. You're about to learn how Australian tactical dominance humbled the world's most powerful military and forced a complete reevaluation of what battlefield control actually means. Don't click away, because this story will shatter everything you thought you knew about who really ran the Vietnam War. The wake-up call for American forces didn't start at Firebase Delta. It started 4 months earlier, during Operation Paddington, a joint US-Australian sweep through the long high hills. Captain James Roderick, commanding Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, received his mission briefing with complete confidence. His company, 140 men strong, would advance through a valley while an Australian SAS squadron of 24 men operated on the ridgelines providing flank security. Simple. The Americans had the heavy lifting, the Australians had support. Standard Allied cooperation. What Roderick didn't understand was that he wasn't running the operation. He was the bait. The operation launched at first light. Bravo Company advanced in textbook formation. Platoons properly spaced, security elements forward, moving at a steady 150 meters per hour through moderate jungle. Roderick maintained radio contact with the Australian liaison officer, updating position every 30 minutes. Professional, coordinated, exactly by the book. By 1100 hours, Bravo Company had covered 2.3 kilometers without contact. Roderick was pleased. Good progress, no casualties, sector looking clear. Then his radio crackled with the Australian liaison's voice. Bravo 6, be advised you have enemy observation post tracking your movement from grid reference. Roderick checked the coordinates. 800 meters to his northeast, in terrain his maps showed as impassable. Negative, we've got no intel on enemy in that sector. How do you know? Because we're looking at them right now. 3-man op, they've been tracking you for the last 40 minutes. Radioed your position twice. You're being set up for ambush approximately 600 meters ahead, your current heading. Roderick's stomach dropped. Why didn't you report this earlier? We reported it 38 minutes ago to your intelligence shop. They said the area was clear based on aerial reconnaissance and signal intercepts. We're telling you now because the ambush force is moving into position. Roderick halted his company, furious and confused. His own intelligence said the area was clear. But the Australians, with 24 men scattered across the ridgelines, had found enemy observers his 140-man company hadn't detected, were tracking enemy movements his intelligence section had missed, and were watching an ambush develop that would have slaughtered his men. Can you take out the op? Roderick asked. Already done. They went off the air 4 minutes ago, and we've marked the ambush position for airstrike. But Captain, you need to understand something. We've been tracking enemy movement around your company since you inserted. You've been under observation the entire time. They know exactly where you are, where you're going, and how you're moving. You're not hunting them, they're hunting you. We're just making sure they don't catch you. The air strike went in 20 minutes later. Secondary explosions confirmed a major enemy position exactly where the Australians had indicated. Post-strike BDA estimated 40-60 enemy fighters killed or wounded. Bravo Company had walked to within 600 meters of an ambush that would have hit them in a perfect kill zone, and they'd had no idea. The Australians, 1/6 their size, operating in the same terrain, had owned the entire battlefield. They'd known where the enemy was, what the enemy was doing, and what was about to happen. The Americans had known nothing. That night, over cold sea rations in a defensive perimeter, Roderick's radio operator, Specialist Danny Torres, said what everyone was thinking. Sir, if the Aussies hadn't been watching us today, we'd be dead, all of us. We were the targets and we didn't even know it. The pattern repeated across every joint operation. American units would execute competent, textbook tactics, and the Australians would reveal that the Americans were operating in a battlefield they didn't actually control. Firebase security evaluations became legendary nightmares for U.S. commanders. The Australian training teams would request permission to test American defensive positions. Commanders would agree, confident in their preparations. Then, without fail, Australian teams would penetrate the defenses, mark key positions, and extract without triggering alarms. At Firebase Coral in May 1968, an Australian 4-man team penetrated an American perimeter that housed 600 troops, photograph the command post, placed training charges on the ammunition dump, and left a note on the colonel's desk that read, "You died at 3:20 hours. Please improve your wire discipline and LP placement." The note included specific recommendations on the 14 weaknesses they'd exploited. At landing zone Schubert, Australian advisors penetrated the perimeter 3 times in 1 week, each time using a different route, proving that fixing one weakness didn't secure the position. They documented that American listening posts were positioned too close to the wire, guard rotations were predictable down to the minute, and the illumination plan had dead zones large enough to drive a truck through. The American battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hayes, was livid after the 3rd penetration. He demanded a meeting with the Australian team leader, Major Patrick Morrison. "My men are trained, disciplined, following doctrine. How are you getting through defenses that should be impenetrable?" Morrison pulled out a hand-drawn map of the Firebase, marked with routes, timing notes, and guard positions. "Colonel, you're defending against the enemy you expect, not the enemy that exists. Your listening posts are positioned where the manual says to put them, which means anyone who's read the manual knows exactly where they are. Your guard rotations change every 4 hours, exactly on schedule, creating a 3-minute window of confusion we exploit every time. Your illumination plan covers the obvious approaches, so we use the non-obvious ones. You're playing checkers, the enemy is playing chess, and right now you're losing." Hayes stared at the map. Every weakness Morrison identified was exactly what doctrine prescribed, so our own training manual is compromised. "Your manual is designed for conventional European warfare," Morrison explained. "Defensive positions against massed armor and artillery. It's brilliant for that. It's suicide here. The VC don't mass formations against wire. They send sappers who have spent 3 weeks watching your patterns, who know your guard schedule better than your own men, who can smell the difference between American cigarettes and Vietnamese tobacco from 50 meters. You need to defend like you're already infiltrated, because you probably are." The conversation that followed changed Hayes's entire approach to Firebase security. He implemented Australian recommendations, random guard rotations, LP positions that changed daily, counter-surveillance patrols that watched the watchers, and unpredictable illumination schedules. Within 2 weeks, his Firebase intercepted 3 VC reconnaissance teams that had been mapping the position for a planned sapper attack. The Australians had been right. The Americans had been targets in their own bases. But it wasn't just defensive positions where American forces discovered they were outmatched. Patrol operations revealed an even more disturbing gap. Lieutenant Marcus Washington, platoon leader with the 25th Infantry Division, learned this during a combined patrol with an Australian SAS team in the Phuoc Thai province. Washington's platoon, 32 men, was tasked with a reconnaissance patrol through suspected enemy territory. An Australian 6-man team would operate in the same area, separate missions, but coordinating for mutual support. Both teams inserted via helicopter the same morning. Washington moved his platoon with proper tactical discipline. Point element, main body, rear security. They covered 400 meters the first hour, considered good progress through moderate jungle. By midday, they'd covered 1.8 kilometers, established a patrol base, and sent out security elements. Washington radioed the Australian team for their position. "About 300 meters northwest of you," came the reply. "We're watching an enemy supply route right now." Washington was surprised. His platoon had crossed that area without seeing any trail. "What's your grid?" The Australian read coordinates that showed they were in terrain Washington's maps marked as impassable swamp. "Negative, that area is swamp." "No traversability." "Affirm swamp," the Australian replied, "which is exactly why Charlie uses it, Deep trails, boardwalks in some sections, heavy traffic. We've counted 23 personnel moving south in the last 90 minutes. Washington couldn't believe it. His 32-man platoon had moved through the area and seen nothing. 6 Australians had found a major enemy route his entire element had missed. How did we miss it? Because you walked around the swamp, the Australian explained patiently. Which is what everyone does, which is why the enemy knows that's what you'll do, which is why they use the route everyone avoids. You're moving where it's easy. The enemy moves where it's effective. Washington felt his confidence crumbling. Can you guide us to the trail? Negative. You're too large, too loud, and you're already being watched. We spotted enemy scouts shadowing you about 40 minutes ago. You've got 3 military-age males tracking your movement from the west. They know where you are. You don't know where they are. If you try to reposition, you'll trigger contact on ground they've chosen. The revelation hit Washington like cold water. His platoon wasn't conducting a reconnaissance patrol. They were being reconnaissance. The enemy was tracking them, studying their movements, gathering intelligence on American tactics. Meanwhile, the Australians, 1/5 the size, were actually finding the enemy and observing them undetected. What should we do? Washington asked. Complete your patrol as planned, the Australian advised. We'll track the shadows and report enemy movement patterns. But, Lieutenant, you need to understand something fundamental. Size doesn't equal effectiveness here. Your 32 men make 32 times as much noise, leave 32 times as much sign, and require 32 times as much coordination. You're like an elephant trying to hunt mice. We're like a snake. Different tools for different jobs. That night, the Australian team reported that the 3 enemy scouts tracking Washington's platoon had reported American positions, movements, and strength to a local VC commander, who had decided the American force was too large to ambush effectively and had repositioned forces away from their route. Washington's platoon had been assessed, categorized, and avoided as not worth the tactical effort. The Americans had been targets, examined, and dismissed. The psychological impact was devastating. The problem went beyond tactics to fundamental operational philosophy. American forces operated on the principle of find, fix, and destroy. Search for the enemy, engage with superior firepower, and defeat them through attrition. It was a doctrine that had won World War II in Korea. It was failing spectacularly in Vietnam. The Australians operated on a completely different principle: observe, understand, and control. They didn't necessarily seek contact, they sought knowledge. And knowledge gave them control that firepower couldn't match. This difference became brutally clear during Operation Tambourine in July 1968. An American battalion, 750 men, was tasked with clearing a valley suspected to harbor a VC battalion. The operation plan was textbook: multi-company sweep, artillery prep fires, helicopter gunship support, blocking positions to prevent enemy escape. Maximum firepower, overwhelming force. The Australian Task Force commander, Brigadier Ronald Hughes, reviewed the American plan and politely suggested modifications. The American battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Bradford, listened with barely concealed impatience. Brigadier, I appreciate Australian tactics work for small unit operations, but this is a battalion-level operation. We need firepower and force, not stealth. Hughes nodded. Colonel, I'm not suggesting you cancel your operation. I'm suggesting you're about to push 750 men through a valley that the enemy abandoned 36 hours ago, because our reconnaissance teams reported your operational planning to us. And signals intelligence indicates they've intercepted your radio traffic and repositioned accordingly. Bradford's face went red. Our communications are encrypted. Your communications use predictable frequency patterns, transmission times. and duration that signals analysis can track even without breaking encryption, Hughes explained. The enemy knows when you're planning operations based on the increase in radio traffic. They know where you're planning to operate based on aerial reconnaissance of your staging areas. And they know when to avoid contact because you telegraph every move. That's impossible, Bradford insisted. We have operational security protocols that you follow predictably, Hughes interrupted gently. Colonel, the enemy has been fighting in this valley for 20 years. They know every trail, every cache site, every fighting position. When you mass 750 men, they hear you coming from kilometers away. When you prep with artillery, you announce exactly where you're going. When you insert helicopters, you show them your landing zones. You're not surprising anyone. You're conducting a very loud, very expensive training exercise that the enemy watches from a safe distance. Bradford was furious. But Hughes's Australian liaison teams had been right too many times to dismiss. What would you do differently? Hughes pulled out a map. Reconnaissance first. Small teams, multiple insertions over 2 weeks, building pattern-of-life intelligence. Where does the enemy actually operate? When do they move? Where are their supply routes, base camps, leadership positions? Once we understand their pattern, we can disrupt it surgically. One well-placed ambush on a supply route does more damage than a battalion sweep through empty jungle. Bradford reluctantly agreed to delay the operation for 72 hours while Australian reconnaissance. Teams gathered intelligence. What they found humiliated the American intelligence section. The VC battalion wasn't in the valley. They'd repositioned to a series of base camps 8 kilometers to the east, in terrain the Americans had assessed as too difficult to occupy. The valley contained only a small security element and a network of empty bunkers designed to waste American resources. The Australian teams identified the actual VC positions, mapped their supply routes, and documented leadership movement patterns. The operation was redesigned based on this intelligence. Instead of a massive sweep through empty jungle, the Americans positioned blocking forces on the VC supply routes, while Australian teams directed precision airstrikes on the base camps. The results were devastating for the enemy and vindicating for Hughes. Estimated 120 enemy casualties, massive supply losses, and disruption of VC operations in the region for 3 months. American casualties, 0. The original operation plan would have resulted in perhaps 5-10 enemy killed, exhausted American troops, and likely casualties from booby traps in the abandoned positions. Bradford's after-action report was honest and painful. Australian reconnaissance capabilities exceed American intelligence collection by an order of magnitude. Their understanding of enemy operations is superior. Their operational patience is superior. And their results prove that we have been conducting operations based on assumptions rather than knowledge. The personal impact on American soldiers was profound. They'd trained for years, believed themselves to be the world's finest military, and deployed to Vietnam with confidence. Discovering that Allied forces 1/10 their size were dramatically more effective was a psychological shock that rippled through units. Sergeant First Class Robert Chen, who'd served at Firebase Delta during the infamous penetration exercise, described the emotional impact years later. I'd done 2 tours in Germany, trained in every tactical scenario, earned every qualification. I thought I was a professional soldier. Then these Australians walked through our defenses like we were children playing war. And the worst part, they weren't arrogant about it. They were patient, almost sad, like they were disappointed that we didn't understand the basic rules of the game we were playing. It wasn't just tactics, it was philosophy. We were trained to find and kill the enemy. They were trained to understand and control the battlefield. We measured success in body count. They measured success in intelligence gathered and enemy operations disrupted. We wanted to win firefights. They wanted to win the war. And the gap between those two goals was enormous. The psychological burden carried different weight for different soldiers. Some became bitter, resentful of allies who made them feel inadequate. Others became eager students, desperate to learn from the Australians before their tour ended. The smart ones realized that the Australians weren't trying to embarrass anyone. They were trying to keep allies alive in an environment that punished conventional thinking. The command-level recognition came slowly but inexorably. By late 1968, MACV intelligence assessments began incorporating a disturbing pattern. Australian forces, representing less than 2% of Allied combat strength in Vietnam, were producing nearly 18% of actionable tactical intelligence. Their casualty rates were one-third that of American units operating in comparable terrain. Their operations-to-contact ratio was dramatically higher. Every metric that mattered showed Australian operational superiority. General Creighton Abrams, who assumed MACV command in June 1968, requested a classified assessment of Australian tactical methods and their applicability to American forces. The resulting report, still partially classified, was devastating in its conclusions. Australian forces controlled their battle space through intelligence dominance, operational patience, and tactical flexibility that American doctrine couldn't replicate without fundamental restructuring. The key finding: Australian units operate with the assumption that the enemy always knows American positions and intentions. American units operate with the assumption that our security and firepower provide protection. The Australian assumption is correct. The American assumption is fatal. The report recommended wholesale adoption of Australian reconnaissance methods, patrol techniques, and Firebase security procedures. It suggested that American units should assume they were under constant enemy observation and plan accordingly. It proposed that small, well-trained teams produced better intelligence than large, heavily equipped formations. Implementation was slow and incomplete. The American military system wasn't designed for rapid doctrinal change. Training pipelines took months to modify. Equipment procurement took years. Cultural attitudes took even longer. But at the tactical level, where survival mattered more than doctrine, American soldiers learned fast. Firebase commanders started requesting Australian advisors. Patrol leaders sought cross-training. Intelligence sections began coordinating with Australian sources. The changes happened unit by unit, soldier by soldier, driven not by orders but by the desperate desire to survive. The most powerful validation came from the soldiers who experienced combat alongside Australian forces. Corporal James Mitchell, 101st Airborne Division, participated in a joint operation near the Cambodian border that crystallized everything. His company was part of a larger sweep operation. An Australian SAS squadron was operating in the same area, supposedly providing reconnaissance. What Mitchell witnessed changed his understanding of warfare fundamentally. The American company moved through jungle, standard patrol formation, maintaining noise and light discipline as trained. Professional, competent, by the book. The Australians were somewhere ahead, maintaining radio silence except for scheduled check-ins. At 14:20 hours, the American company walked into an ambush. L-shaped kill zone, professional execution, heavy initial casualties. The company commander was hit in the first burst. The radio operator went down immediately. Standard chaos of contact. What happened next defied Mitchell's understanding of combat. Before the American return fire even began, the ambush collapsed. Not retreated, collapsed. The enemy machine gun position on the left flank exploded. The RPG position on the right flank went silent. The mortar crew 400 meters to the rear stopped firing. Within 90 seconds of the ambush initiation, the enemy force was withdrawing in disorder, leaving weapons and wounded. The Americans hadn't fired enough rounds to cause that level of damage. Mitchell's squad leader, Sergeant Chen, figured it out first. The Aussies, they were already in position. They knew this ambush was coming. The Australian liaison officer confirmed it during the after-action debrief. The SAS team had identified the ambush position 4 hours earlier, had radioed warning to the American battalion, and had positioned themselves to cover the likely kill zone. When the ambush triggered, the Australians had already targeted every enemy position. They'd allowed the ambush to initiate so they could identify all enemy positions, then systematically destroyed them with precise fire. The ambush that should have killed 20-30 Americans resulted in 3 wounded, all recoverable. Because the Australians had controlled the battlefield so completely that even the enemy's chosen ground became a trap for them instead. Mitchell watched the Australian team extract that evening. 6 men, barely visible, moving through jungle like they were part of it. They'd killed an estimated 15-20 enemy fighters, saved dozens of American lives, and done it so smoothly that it looked effortless. "We were bait," Mitchell said to Chen. "The whole time we were just bait and they were the actual hunters." "Yeah," Chen replied, "but we're alive. I'll take being bait if it means going home." The legacy of Australian battlefield dominance in Vietnam extended far beyond the war itself. The American military, shaken by the revelation that tactical competence didn't equal battlefield control, began a fundamental reassessment. The lessons learned from Australian operations influenced the development of American special operations, reconnaissance doctrine, and small unit tactics for the next 50 years. The 75th Ranger Regiment, reformed in 1974, incorporated Australian patrol techniques into their training. Delta Force, established in 1977, sent founding members to train with Australian SAS. The Marine Corps refined their reconnaissance training based on Australian methods. Every branch of American special operations carried DNA from those humbling lessons in Vietnam. But perhaps more importantly, the experience taught American military leadership a crucial lesson about assumptions. The assumption that size equals power. The assumption that technology equals superiority. The assumption that following doctrine equals tactical excellence. The Australians shattered all of these assumptions by controlling battlefields with smaller forces, simpler equipment, and tactics that prioritized understanding over destruction. Today's American military still grapples with these lessons. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in every asymmetric conflict, the same patterns emerge. Large conventional forces operating in terrain they don't fully understand, against enemies who know every trail and trick. And the solutions that work look remarkably similar to what the Australians did in Vietnam. Small teams, deep reconnaissance, pattern-of-life intelligence, and operational patience. The soldiers who served alongside Australian forces in Vietnam carried those lessons for life. Many became instructors, training the next generation differently. Some became commanders, implementing the tactics that had saved their lives. Others simply told their stories, ensuring that the knowledge survived even when doctrine lagged behind reality. Sergeant Chen, whose Firebase was penetrated in that eye-opening exercise, retired as a command sergeant major and spent 15 years at the infantry school teaching defensive tactics. His classes always included a module he called the Australian Wake-Up Call. He described that night in detail: the silence, the penetration, the humiliation, and the lesson. Then he'd say, "The hardest truth in warfare is that being well-trained, well-equipped, and brave isn't enough if you don't control the battlefield. and you can't control what you don't understand. The Australians understood the jungle, understood the enemy, and understood that patience beats aggression every single time. They controlled the battlefield while we were still trying to find it. Learn from that. Your life will depend on it. Those words, spoken to thousands of young soldiers over the years, kept the lesson alive. The Australians weren't just better at jungle warfare. They operated on a different level of tactical thinking that American doctrine struggled to comprehend. They were chess masters playing against checkers players. And until American forces learned to play chess, they remained targets in someone else's game. The story of how U.S. troops realized Australians controlled the battlefield isn't about national pride or rivalry. It's about the brutal teacher called combat, the humility of learning from allies, and the wisdom to recognize when your assumptions are killing you. The Australians offered that wisdom freely, patiently, and professionally. The Americans who accepted it survived. Those who didn't became statistics. 56 years later, that lesson remains as vital as ever. Battlefield control isn't about who has the most troops or the biggest guns. It's about who understands the environment, anticipates enemy action, and operates 3 steps ahead. The Australians mastered that art in Vietnam. The Americans who learned from them brought those lessons home. And modern warfare still operates on principles those 120 Australian advisors proved in the jungles of Southeast Asia. We were the targets, they were the hunters, and learning that distinction saved thousands of American lives. The emotional scars ran deeper than tactical lessons for many American soldiers. Private First Class David Martinez, 4th Infantry Division, experienced this during a patrol that should have been routine. His squad was moving through moderately dense jungle when their point man signaled halt. Fresh footprints, multiple individuals, heading perpendicular to their route. Standard procedure called for the squad leader to radio contact report and decide whether to track or avoid. Before the squad leader could key his radio, an Australian voice whispered from the vegetation 10 meters away. Martinez almost fired from shock. He hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard movement, had no idea anyone was there. An Australian SAS trooper materialized from cover that looked solid, his camouflage so effective he seemed to phase into existence. "Those tracks are 4 hours old," the Australian whispered. 6 VC heading to a supply cache 800 meters northeast. "We've been following them since dawn. They know you're here. They heard you 20 minutes ago and deliberately crossed your path to draw you into pursuing them toward an ambush position." Martinez's squad leader, Sergeant Williams, was experienced enough to listen despite the shock. "How do you know it's an ambush?" The Australian pulled out a small notebook with hand-drawn terrain sketches. "Because we watched them set it up yesterday. 3-man team positioned in heavy cover at the bend in the trail, 600 meters from here. They're waiting for someone to follow those tracks. Classic VC tactic in this area. They've used that same position 4 times in the last month." Williams stared at the sketches, then at his own map, completely blank in that area. "Our intel says this sector is clear." "Your intel is wrong," the Australian said flatly. "Has been for 3 weeks. The VC shifted their operation pattern after your last major sweep. They're adapting faster than your intelligence cycle can track. We reported this to Battalion S2 5 days ago, but apparently it didn't filter down to squad level." The revelation hit Martinez hard. His squad had been about to walk into a prepared ambush, following tracks deliberately left to lure them, into terrain the enemy knew and they didn't, based on intelligence that was weeks out of date. They were sheep being herded to slaughter, and they'd had no idea until a handful of Australians intervened. "What should we do?" Williams asked, and Martinez heard something in his squad leader's voice he'd never heard before. Uncertainty, fear. The admission that he didn't actually know how to operate in this environment. Complete your patrol route as planned, the Australian advised. We'll track the ambush team and call in artillery once you're clear. But Sergeant, when you get back to base, tell your commander that map-based intelligence is killing American soldiers. The enemy owns this terrain. Until you understand that, you're just targets moving through their hunting ground. The Australian faded back into the jungle, gone as silently as he'd appeared. Martinez's squad completed their patrol in shaken silence. Every sound seemed threatening now. Every shadow could hide watchers. The jungle that had seemed merely difficult now felt actively hostile, filled with eyes and intelligence they couldn't match. That night, Martinez wrote a letter home that he never sent. "Mom, I thought we were winning this war. I thought our training and our equipment made us the best. Today I learned that we don't even understand the war we're fighting. There are Australians here who can see things we can't, know things we don't, and operate on a level we can't reach. It's like we're playing a game where everyone else knows the rules except us. I'm scared, Mom, not of the enemy. I'm scared that we don't know enough to survive." The command failures compounded the tactical ones. American intelligence relied on technology and aerial surveillance. Electronic intercepts, photo reconnaissance, sensor nets, producing mountains of data that took weeks to analyze. By the time intelligence reached tactical units, it was obsolete. The Australians operated on human intelligence gathered real-time by operators on the ground. When they reported enemy positions, those positions were current. The gap created tragic failures. In August 1968, American intelligence reported a suspected VC base camp. Intelligence was based on 3-week-old signal intercepts and aerial photography. An American rifle company was tasked to destroy the camp. 24 hours before launch, an Australian patrol radioed the base camp had been abandoned for 2 weeks. The structures were decoys. The actual enemy had relocated 5 kilometers south. The American battalion commander faced a dilemma: cancel and waste resources or proceed despite Australian warning. He proceeded. The company found abandoned positions, exactly as Australians reported. But the enemy knew where Americans had landed. They'd left the decoy deliberately. The VC allowed 4 hours of searching, gathering intelligence on American tactics. Then they hit the landing zone with mortars, killing 2 and wounding 7. The after-action report: Australian ground reconnaissance proved accurate. American technical intelligence proved dangerously outdated. Recommend commanders trust Australian field reports over technical intelligence when discrepancies arise. The personal relationships between American and Australian soldiers revealed the human dimension. Corporal Tommy Jackson became friends with Australian SAS trooper Bill Henderson during a joint operation. Over 3 days, Jackson watched Henderson move through jungle like he'd been born there. Not just quietly, but intelligently. He avoided easy trails because they'd be watched. He read signs Jackson couldn't see: broken twigs, disturbed earth, bird behavior revealing human presence. "How do you see all that?" Jackson asked. Henderson smiled. "I don't see it, mate, I feel it. The jungle talks if you listen. You're trying to impose yourself on the jungle. I'm trying to become part of it." Big difference. Henderson's team avoided 2 enemy patrols the Americans never detected, identified 3 concealed caches, and gathered intelligence the American battalion had sought for weeks. 4 Australians accomplished what 20 Americans couldn't. On the final night, Jackson asked, "Why are you guys so much better at this?" Henderson was quiet. "You're not bad soldiers, Tommy. You're brave, well-trained, disciplined. But you're trained for the wrong war. This is guerrilla warfare in an environment that favors the guerrilla. Until America recognizes that, you'll keep being targets instead of hunters." The statistical validation emerged years later when classified studies analyzed operational effectiveness. Australian forces operated with casualty rates 40% lower than American units in comparable terrain, while achieving intelligence collection rates 300% higher. Their patrols made contact 65% of the time they sought it, compared to 23% for American patrols. When Australian forces established defensive positions, enemy attacks decreased by 47%, suggesting enemies chose to avoid them. The difference wasn't physical toughness or equipment. It was operational method. The Australians controlled tempo, chose engagements, and avoided unnecessary casualties through superior intelligence and patience. They fought smarter, not harder. But statistics don't capture the human reality. Every American soldier who discovered they were operating in a battlefield they didn't control faced a crisis. Some responded with anger. Some with fear. The best responded with humility and determination to learn. Those soldiers became the bridge between Australian excellence and American adaptation. Modern American Special Operations forces owe an unpayable debt to those Australian advisors who patiently taught battlefield control to allies who needed the lesson. Every ranger who learns to move silently, every Green Beret who masters reconnaissance, every SEAL who understands that patience beats aggression, they're all inheritors of lessons paid for in humiliation and validated in survival. The doctrine manuals updated slowly, but the knowledge transferred soldier to soldier until it became embedded in American Special Operations culture. Today, when Delta Force trains with Australian SASR, when Rangers cross-train at Singleton, when Marines attend Australian reconnaissance courses, they're continuing a tradition that started when American forces realized they were targets in a war they thought they were winning. The Australians didn't just teach tactics, they taught a philosophy: understand before you act, observe before you engage, know before you move. We were the targets, they were the hunters. And the Americans who survived learned to become hunters too. That's the real legacy, not humiliation, but transformation. The willingness to admit inadequacy and learn from those who knew better. In warfare, pride kills. Humility saves. The Australians taught that lesson. The Americans who listened lived to teach it to the next generation. And that knowledge continues to save lives today.